the flickering light of Asia, or the Assyrian nation and church. In the city of Khoi, there had never been an Assyrian colony. In the suburbs of the city, however, there had existed an Armenian community of some 2,000 to 2,500 souls. In order to accommodate the mountain-tier Assyrian refugees who had fled into Persia more comfortably, Marshamun Binyamin had arranged for some 3,500 of his people, mostly from Tehuma, to reside in the district of Khoi. As already remarked in the course of this narrative, the people of Tehuma, though smaller in numbers, were considered as the bravest and the best fighters of all the Assyrian independent tribes. After the collapse of Russia and the retreat of the Russian forces from Persia, these Assyrians became isolated and almost entirely cut off from the rest of the Assyrian people in Salamis and Urmia. The Muslims of the last two named districts, severely punished and thoroughly convinced that they, unless aided by the Turks, would never dare to lift another hand against the Christians. But the Muslims of Khoi, even though they had seen their regular army defeated and crushed by the Assyrian troops in Salinas, had been looking for an opportunity to follow the envied example of their co-religiousness and share the rewards promised by their prophets for the murdering of the infidel Christians. The opportunity they were looking for arrived with the second invasion of Armenia by the Turks, and the latter's entry in force into northern Persia. The atrocities of Khoi have perhaps surpassed all the previous atrocities perpetrated against the Christians, either by the Turks in Turkey or by the Persian Mohammedans in Persia. A description of this Muslim's barbarism is given by the Rev. John Ishu, who himself was one of those few that escaped in a most miraculous way from the wrath of Islam. He writes, "You have undoubtedly heard of the Christian massacre at Khoi, but I am certain you do not know the details. Here had migrated a part of our people, and 1/4 of our refugees were stationed in Sardavar. These Assyrians were assembled into one caravanserai, and all shot to death by guns and revolvers. Blood literally flowed into little streams, and the entire open space within the caravanserai became a pool of crimson liquid. The place was too small to hold all the living victims for the work of execution. They were brought in groups, and each new group compelled to stand up over the heap of the still bleeding bodies, and was shot to death in the same manner. The fearful place became literally a human slaughterhouse, receiving its speechless victims in groups of 10 and 20 at a time for execution. At the same time, the Assyrians who were residing in the suburb of the city were brought together and driven into the spacious courtyard of a house, while the Armenians of the place were removed into a city proper from the same devilish purpose. The Assyrian refugees were kept under guard for 8 days, without saying anything to eat except a handful of popcorn served daily to each individual. This consideration was by no means intended as a humanitarian act, but merely to keep the victims alive for the infliction upon them of the most revolting tortures at a convenient time set for their execution. At last they were removed from their place of confinement and taken to a spot prepared for their brutal killing. The helpless Assyrians marched like lambs to their slaughter, and they opened not their mouth save by saying, "Lord, into thy hands we commit our spirits." The procession of the victims was led by 2 green-turbaned Sayyids, the highest religious order in Islam, one with an open book in his hand, reading from it aloud the passages pertaining to the holy war, and the other carrying a large bladed knife, the emblem of execution. When the procession arrived at the place appointed, the executioners began by cutting first the fingers of their victims, joint by joint, till the 2 hands were entirely amputated. Then they were stretched on the ground, after the manner of the animals that are slain in the east, but these with their faces turned upward and their heads resting upon the stones or blocks of wood. Then their throats were half cut, so as to prolong their torture of dying, and while struggling in the agony of death, the victims were kicked and clubbed by heavy poles the murderers carried. Many of them, while still laboring under the pain of death, were thrown into ditches and buried before their souls had expired. The young men and the able-bodied men were separated from among the very young and the old. They were taken some distance from the city and used as targets by the shooters. They all fell, a few not mortally wounded, One of the leaders went close to the heaps of the fallen and shouted aloud, swearing by the names of Islam's prophets, that those who had not received mortal wounds should rise and depart, as they would not be harmed any more. A few, thus deceived, stood up, but only to fall this time dead by another volley from the guns of the murderers. Some of the younger and goodly-looking women, together with a few little girls of attractive appearance who pleaded to be killed against their will, were forced into Islam's harems. Others were subjected to such fiendish insults that I cannot possibly describe. Death, however, came to their rescue and saved them from the vile passions of the demons. The Assyrian victims of this massacre totaled 2,770 men, women, and children, exclusive of an equal number of the Armenians. While in Paris, I called the attention of the Persian delegation both to the hideous atrocities to which the Assyrians were subjected in Persia, and also to my contention as to the claims that I and my colleagues presented at the peace conference in behalf of the Assyrians. This contention was all still is that, inasmuch as the Persian government is unable to maintain order or subdue the passions or control the lawlessness of its Muslim subjects in those parts of Persia, and inasmuch as the Persian government would be unable to meet the just reparation claims of the Assyrians, both for the loss of property and for the wanton destruction of life, the said government should be willing to part with Urmia and the adjoining area claimed by the Assyrians as their homeland. If, however, a bargain of this character was to be effected on the basis of justice and equity, not Salamis and Urmia only, but the entire state of the Persian Azerbaijan could by no means be regarded as an adequate exchange for the sufferings and the losses and the fearful outrages inflicted upon the Assyrians in Persia.